You open some random page on the internet, you search how to make better decisions. A list appears, and at the foundation of that list, without you even realizing it, there's a man who's been dead for over 2,000 years, dictating every word. He's not in self-help books. He doesn't show up on productivity podcasts. But he's there. He's always been there. This man walked the streets of a city that no longer exists. He was the student of a genius. He educated the most devastating conqueror in history. And the end of his life? Well, that's a story few people truly know. But the most disturbing part isn't how he lived. It's what he's still doing to you. Right now, at this very moment. He governs your mind, your categories of thought, the way you separate right from wrong, true from false, possible from impossible. To understand who this thinker is, we need to go back in time. Long before Rome dominated the world, before the medieval empires, before Christ. We're in ancient Greece, the 4th century before the Common Era. Athens is buzzing. It's the intellectual center of the known world. Through its narrow streets walk merchants, slaves, soldiers, and philosophers. Men obsessed with one single thing, the truth. Not the truth of the gods, not the truth of myths, but the truth that's reached through reason, through questioning, through observation. It's in this environment that a revolutionary institution emerges. The Academy. Founded by Plato, Socrates' most famous disciple, it becomes the first great center of higher learning in Western history. There, young men from all over Greece came to learn geometry, astronomy, dialectics, and above all, the art of thinking. Plato taught that the world we see is merely a shadow, an imperfect copy. True knowledge, he said, lies beyond the senses, in what he called the world of ideas. Perfect forms, eternal, unchanging. It was a grand vision, almost mystical. But there was a young man among the students who looked at this teaching with admiration and with doubt. He arrived at the academy at 17. He came from far away, from a region to the north, considered almost barbaric by the refined Athenians. His father was a physician to the royal court of Macedonia, a detail that, later on, would change everything. This young man was brilliant, curious, tireless, and he did something few dared to do. He disagreed with the master, not out of arrogance, not out of empty rebellion, but because his mind worked differently. Where Plato looked to the sky in search of eternal essences, this student looked at the ground, at the animals, at the plants, at the innards of fish. He wanted to understand nature, not escape from it. And so began a silent rupture, a divergence that would take decades to mature, and that, in the end, would give rise to a new way of seeing the world, a way that, without you knowing it, still shapes your every thought. Origins, his name was Aristotle. He was born in 384 before the Common Era, in a small city called Stagira, a Greek colony on the border with Macedonia, a place far from the brilliance of Athens, a place of physicians, not philosophers. His father, Nicomachus, was the personal physician to King Amyntas III of Macedonia, Alexander the Great's grandfather. This means that from childhood, Aristotle lived among the political elite of a rising kingdom. He saw power up close, along with disease, death, and the fragility of human bodies. But he also saw something else: method. Greek medicine at the time wasn't magic. It was observation, diagnosis, classification of symptoms, cause and effect. This way of thinking, empirical, systematic, investigative, entered Aristotle's blood before he even knew what philosophy was. When he was still a teenager, he lost his parents, both of them. Death came early and left marks we'll never fully know. What we do know is that, orphaned and heir to some fortune, he was sent to Athens at 17. Why? Because there was a place that attracted the brightest minds in the Greek world, Plato's academy. Imagine the scene. A young Macedonian with a foreign accent, no Athenian connections, no family nearby, entering the most prestigious circle of thinkers of the time. All around him, sons of the aristocracy, older men, disciples who had already mastered Platonic dialectics, and at the center of it all, Plato, already old, already legendary. A man who had transformed Socrates' teachings into a grand system, the world of ideas, the immortality of the soul, the search for truth beyond appearances. Aristotle could have bowed down. He could have become just another faithful follower. But something in him resisted. He spent 20 years at the academy. 20 years, that's longer than many people spend at any institution throughout their entire lives. During that time, he absorbed everything, read everything, debated everything. And he began to write dialogues in Plato's style, almost all of them lost today. But behind the admiration, a divergence was growing. Plato believed that true reality lay beyond what we can see and touch. The things of the physical world, a tree, a horse, a person, were merely imperfect copies of eternal forms. True knowledge, therefore, came from pure reason, not from sensory experience. Aristotle disagreed, not publicly, not aggressively. But in silence, in the margins of his studies, he began to formulate another vision. For him, reality was here, in this world, in this specific tree, this specific horse, this flesh and blood human being. The essence of things didn't inhabit some celestial plane. It was in the things themselves. And to know it, one had to look, touch, dissect, classify. This physician's son never abandoned the intellectual scalpel he inherited from his father. There's a phrase attributed to him centuries later that sums up this tension. I'm a friend of Plato, but I'm a greater friend of the truth. We don't know if he actually said it, but the idea is accurate. Aristotle respected the master. He admired him deeply, and yet he chose truth as his guide, even when it led him away from Plato. When Plato died in 347 before the Common Era, many expected Aristotle to take over the leadership of the academy. He was the most brilliant, the most productive, the most original. But that's not what happened. The leadership of the academy went to Speusippus, Plato's nephew, a less talented man, but with the right blood. Aristotle, the foreigner, the Macedonian, the one who thought differently, was left out. And so he left. We don't know exactly what he felt. Disappointment, relief, freedom. What we do know is that from that moment on, he was no longer a student, and he began to forge his own path, a path that would forever change the history of human thought. Rise Aristotle left Athens, but he never stopped thinking. The following years were ones of intellectual wandering. First, he went to Assos, a city on the coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. There, a former colleague from the academy named Hermias ruled as tyrant. Hermias was a rare case, a man of power who loved philosophy, and he welcomed Aristotle as a friend. It was in Assos that Aristotle truly began his work. Far from Plato's shadow, he could finally develop his own ideas. He founded a small school, gathered disciples, and began to investigate the natural world with an intensity no Greek philosopher had demonstrated before. But life was also happening. Aristotle married Pythias, Hermias's niece. It was, by all indications, a marriage of genuine affection. They had a daughter who was given the same name as her mother, and for a brief moment the philosopher knew something like stability. It didn't last long. Hermias was captured by the Persians, tortured, killed, the city fell, and Aristotle, once again, had to leave. This time he went to the island of Lesbos, more specifically, to the city of Mytilene. And here, something extraordinary happened. In Lesbos, Aristotle met Theophrastus, a brilliant young man who would become his successor and lifelong friend. Together, they did what no one had done with such systematic rigor. They studied nature, not in an abstract way, not based on theories about ideal forms, but with their feet in the mud, their hands on shells, their eyes on the innards of animals. Aristotle dissected fish. He observed the reproduction of octopuses. He classified hundreds of species. He recorded the behavior of bees. He studied the gestation of mammals. He created categories. He separated animals with blood from animals without blood, a division that, centuries later, would roughly correspond to vertebrates and invertebrates. No one before him had looked at nature with such patience and such rigor, and he didn't do this out of idle curiosity. He did it because he believed in something profound, that true knowledge begins with observation, that reality isn't hidden in some metaphysical heaven. It's here, within reach of the senses, waiting to be understood. While Plato said that the senses deceive us, Aristotle responded, the senses are where everything begins. This divergence might seem technical, too philosophical, abstract, but its consequences are colossal. Because from this simple inversion, looking at the world instead of fleeing from it, the scientific method was born. Biology as a discipline was born. Formal logic was born. In a sense, Western thought as we know it was born. But Aristotle hadn't yet reached his peak. One decisive chapter was still missing. In 343 before the Common Era, an unexpected invitation arrived. King Philip II of Macedonia, the most powerful man in Greece at that moment, wanted a tutor for his teenage son. And not just any tutor. He wanted the greatest living philosopher. He chose Aristotle. The boy was 13 years old. He was impetuous, ambitious, obsessed with Homer and military glory. His name was Alexander. Yes, that Alexander. The one who would conquer the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The one who would spread Greek culture to Egypt, Persia, India. The one who would die at 32, undefeated in battle, lord of lands no European had ever set foot on before. And it was Aristotle who educated him. For about 3 years, the philosopher lived at the Macedonian court. He taught the young prince logic, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetry, medicine, natural science. It's said he prepared a special edition of the Iliad for him, which Alexander would carry for the rest of his life, keeping it under his pillow alongside a dagger. What exactly did Aristotle pass on to Alexander? We don't know for certain, but something from this encounter left its mark. Alexander would bring naturalists and scientists with him on his military campaigns. He would send specimens of plants and animals back to Greece, so that Aristotle could continue his studies. It was a strange relationship. The thinker and the conqueror, the man of reason and the man of the sword. One sought wisdom, the other glory. One wanted to understand the world, the other wanted to dominate it, and yet something united them. Both believed that human beings were capable of greatness, that life should be lived in pursuit of excellence, that mediocrity was a betrayal of human potential. When Alexander set off on his conquests, Aristotle returned to Athens. It was 335 before the Common Era. He was nearly 50 years old, and he was about to found something that would rival, and eventually surpass, Plato's academy. It was called the Lyceum. It was a public gymnasium dedicated to Apollo Lycaeus on the outskirts of Athens. There, Aristotle gathered disciples, organized a library, and created what may have been the first institution of systematic research in history. The method was simple and revolutionary at the same time. Collect information about everything. Everything. Constitutions of Greek cities, animal behavior, physical theories, treatises on ethics, political systems, forms of argumentation. Aristotle and his students would walk through the gardens as they discussed, and that's why they became known as the peripatetics, the ones who walk. But make no mistake, this wasn't a contemplative stroll. It was work. Rigorous, methodical, tireless. In just over a decade, Aristotle produced a quantity of works that defies comprehension. Logic, physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, poetics, rhetoric, biology, psychology, meteorology, treatises on the soul, on memory, on dreams. No thinker before him, and very few after, covered so many fields of knowledge with such depth. He didn't just think. He classified, organized, created systems. He invented formal logic, the syllogism, the categories, the principles of demonstration. Before him, the Greeks argued. After him, they knew exactly how and why an argument was valid or invalid. But there was more. Aristotle also asked questions that no one had asked with such clarity. What is happiness? What is the purpose of human life? What does it mean to live well? His answer became known as eudaimonia, a Greek word that doesn't translate easily. It's not pleasure. It's not wealth. It's something like human flourishing, living in accordance with virtue, fully realizing what it means to be human, exercising reason, the faculty that distinguishes us from all other beings. For Aristotle, happiness wasn't a passive state. It was an activity, a constant practice, the soul in full exercise of its highest capacities. And here's the crucial point. This idea that the good life depends on cultivating virtues, on balancing extremes, on acting with practical wisdom, crossed the centuries. It's present in Stoicism, in medieval Christian thought, in modern ethical theories, and yes, in the self-help books you can find in any bookstore today. The Lyceum was thriving. Aristotle was the most influential philosopher of his generation. Alexander, his former student, dominated the world. Everything seemed to be at its peak, but history rarely allows peaks to last. The year was 323 before the Common Era. News crossed the Mediterranean like a lightning bolt. Alexander was dead. He was only 32 years old. He died in Babylon, perhaps from fever, perhaps poisoned, perhaps consumed by his own excesses. No one knows for certain. What we do know is that within days, the greatest empire ever built began to crack. And for Aristotle, Alexander's death wasn't just a political tragedy. It was a sentence. Consider this. Aristotle was Macedonian. He had educated the conqueror. He maintained ties with the court. While Alexander lived, this meant protection, prestige, security. But now he was the tyrant's philosopher, the foreigner who had taught the man who subjugated Athens, the collaborator with the enemy. The Athenians had never loved the Macedonians. They tolerated them while they were strong. But with Alexander dead, revolt erupted, and with it came the hunt for suspects. Aristotle was accused of impiety. Impiety, the same crime that had killed Socrates 76 years earlier. The same vague and convenient pretext that the Athenians used whenever they wanted to eliminate someone troublesome. It's said the accusation was based on a hymn Aristotle had written years before in memory of Hermias, his friend murdered by the Persians. The hymn supposedly treated Hermias as a god, which would constitute blasphemy. It was a flimsy pretext, ridiculous even, but Aristotle knew history. He knew what had happened to Socrates. The trial, the hemlock, death turned into spectacle, and he made a decision. He would not stay to be judged. There's a phrase attributed to him at this moment, one of the most famous in the history of philosophy. I will not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy. Whether it's true or not, the phrase captures something essential. Aristotle didn't flee out of cowardice. He fled out of refusal. He refused to give the Athenians the satisfaction of condemning him. He refused to repeat Socrates' martyrdom. He refused to turn his death into a political headline. He left for Chalkis, a city on the island of Euboea, his mother's homeland, where he still had family property. And there, in exile, far from Athens, far from the Lyceum he had built, far from the disciples he had trained, Aristotle lived his final months. What did he think during those last days? What did he feel? The records are sparse. We know he left a will, a surprisingly human document, full of care for his slaves, instructions to free some of them, concerns for his daughter, arrangements regarding his wife's tomb. We know he asked to be buried beside Pythias, and we know that in 322 before the Common Era, just 1 year after Alexander's death, Aristotle died. He was 62 years old. The exact cause is uncertain. Natural illness, probably. Some ancient sources mention stomach problems, others speculate. But there's no evidence of violence or suicide. He simply ended. The philosopher who had classified the world, who had mapped logic, who had defined happiness, who had taught kings, died in exile, quietly, while the world he knew crumbled around him, and for a moment it seemed like everything was over. The Lyceum passed to Theophrastus, his most faithful disciple. Aristotle's works, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, were scattered. Some were lost, others were hidden. Tradition tells us that his manuscripts were stored in a cellar for generations, deteriorating in the dampness, forgotten. Alexander's empire fragmented in wars of succession. Greece lost its centrality. Rome rose. The world changed, and Aristotle, apparently, became the past. But history has twists that no one foresees. Because those forgotten manuscripts, those pages eaten away by moisture and time, would be rediscovered, copied, translated. First into Arabic by scholars in Baghdad who saw him as the greatest of philosophers. Then into Latin by medieval monks trying to reconcile his reason with Christian faith. And slowly, century after century, Aristotle returned. Not as a historical figure, not as an academic curiosity, but as a force, a structure, a way of thinking so fundamental that it became invisible, like the air we breathe, like the grammar we use without realizing it. The breaking point wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of another story. Consequences. What happens when a thinker dies? In most cases, their ideas die with them, or they survive for a generation, maybe two, before dissolving into oblivion. The history of human thought is a graveyard of philosophical systems that once seemed eternal and are now footnotes. With Aristotle, the opposite happened. He died in 322 before the Common Era. And then, for centuries, he seemed to disappear. His most important works, the technical treatises he used at the Lyceum, fell out of circulation. What circulated were the dialogues written for the general public, almost all of them lost today. The Aristotle the ancient world knew was a shadow of the real Aristotle. But in the 1st century before the Common Era, something changed. A scholar named Andronicus of Rhodes organized and published the Lyceum manuscripts, the very ones that, according to legend, had spent generations in a damp cellar. For the first time, the world had access to the complete system, the logic, the physics, the metaphysics, the ethics, the politics, the poetics. And the impact was seismic. Rome absorbed Aristotle, not directly, but through philosophical schools that drew from his sources. Stoicism, for example, owed much to his logic and ethics. Cicero quoted him. Physicians studied him. Roman education carried, in its structures, the Aristotelian mark. Then came Christianity, and here the story gets even stranger. The early Christian theologians were suspicious of Aristotle. He was a pagan. He believed in the eternity of the world, not in creation. He didn't speak of salvation, of sin, of divine grace. At first glance, he seemed incompatible with the faith. But there was a problem. Aristotle was too useful. His logic was perfect for constructing theological arguments. His categories allowed for organizing discussions about the nature of God, the soul, the sacraments. His concept of causality helped explain how an eternal God could create a temporal world. And so, slowly, the Church began to absorb him. The turning point came in the 13th century with a Dominican friar named Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas did something audacious. He took Aristotelian philosophy, pagan, naturalist, centered on reason, and fused it with Christian theology. The result was scholasticism, the intellectual system that dominated Europe for centuries. For the medievals, Aristotle wasn't just one philosopher among others. He was the philosopher, just like that, with a capital letter and the definite article. Quoting him was almost as authoritative as quoting scripture. Think about what that means. A man who had died 1,500 years earlier in a completely different culture, in a completely different religion, became the intellectual backbone of European Christendom. His ideas about logic defined how theologians argued. His ideas about ethics shaped the concept of Christian virtue. His ideas about politics influenced theories of government. His ideas about metaphysics provided the vocabulary for discussing God, the soul, existence. And it didn't stop there. While medieval Europe studied Aristotle in Latin, the Islamic world studied him in Arabic, and with even greater fervor. Philosophers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes didn't just preserve Aristotle. They expanded him, commented on him, debated him. For them, too, he was the master of reason. Averroes, in particular, wrote commentaries so detailed that he became known simply as the commentator, just as Aristotle was the philosopher. It was through Arabic translations that many Aristotelian works returned to Europe. Christian scholars learned Arabic to read Aristotle. Universities were founded to study him. The entire system of European higher education, the faculties, the curricula, the methods of disputation, bears the mark of this obsession. But then came the Renaissance, and after that, the scientific revolution. And here, many imagine, Aristotle was surpassed. Galileo refuted his physics. Newton replaced it. Darwin explained life without resorting to final causes. Modern science, they say, was born against Aristotle. This is true, in part. Aristotelian physics was indeed abandoned. His geocentric cosmology collapsed. Many of his natural explanations proved wrong. But the curious thing is that even as scientists rejected his answers, they continued to use his questions. They continued to think in categories he had invented. They continued to apply a logic he had formalized. And in other areas, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetics, Aristotle was never refuted. He was discussed, criticized, reinterpreted, but never surpassed. Even today, when philosophers debate what it means to live well, they're in dialogue with the Nicomachean ethics. When political scientists analyze forms of government, they echo the politics. When literary critics discuss narrative structure, they invoke the poetics. When logicians teach syllogisms, they're repeating lessons from the organon. And there's something deeper, the very structure of Western thought. The division between subject and object, between form and matter, between potentiality and actuality, between essence and existence, comes from Aristotle. These are categories so basic they seem natural. They seem obvious. They seem like the only possible way to think. But they're not. They're Aristotelian. When you ask, "What is this?" you're asking an Aristotelian question about essence. When you ask, "What is it for?" you're seeking a final cause, an Aristotelian concept. When you classify, categorize, define, organize, you're applying methods he systematized. The philosopher who died in exile over 2 millennia ago isn't a relic of the past. He is the invisible operating system of Western thought. And most people live inside this system without ever realizing it exists. Now pause for a moment. Look at your own life, at the decisions you make, at the judgments you form, at the way you organize the world inside your head. You probably didn't wake up today thinking about Aristotle. You didn't quote the metaphysics at breakfast. You didn't consult the Nicomachean ethics before replying to a message. And yet, he was there. When you think this is true or false, you're using a binary logic that Aristotle formalized. The principle of non-contradiction, the foundation of all valid reasoning, was articulated by him. A thing cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same respect. Does it seem obvious? Does it seem natural? Of course it does. Because you've been trained since childhood to think this way, and that training has an author. When you classify things into categories, animal, vegetable, mineral, causes and effects, means and ends, you're applying an Aristotelian method. He was the first to systematize the art of dividing the world into genera and species, into substances and accidents, into essences and attributes. The biology you studied in school? It was born from his efforts in Lesbos, dissecting fish and cataloging species. The logic that underpins mathematics, computing, programming. It descends directly from the syllogisms he invented, and it goes further. When you ask yourself what would truly make me happy, you're raising an Aristotelian question. He said that happiness, eudaimonia, isn't fleeting pleasure, isn't the accumulation of goods, isn't fame or power. It's the flourishing of the soul in virtuous activity. It's living according to reason, exercising the best in us. This idea crossed the centuries. It's present in Stoicism, which teaches virtue as the path to tranquility. It's present in medieval Christian ethics, which adapted Aristotelian virtues to the context of faith. It's present in diluted and sometimes distorted form in the personal development books that promise a life with purpose. The search for meaning that you feel, that restlessness that life should be more than just surviving, is an Aristotelian inheritance. He was one of the first to take seriously the question, what does it mean to live well? Not just to exist, but to exist fully. And there's another dimension. When you debate politics, democracy versus authoritarianism, freedom versus equality, individual rights versus the common good, you're treading ground that Aristotle mapped first. He analyzed over 150 constitutions of Greek cities. He classified forms of government. He identified their virtues and their corruptions. He asked, what is the purpose of the political community? What makes a city just? These questions haven't aged. They're alive in every election, in every public debate, in every discussion about the role of the state. And perhaps most impressive, Aristotle taught us to think in a balanced way. He distrusted extremes. His ethics is famous for the concept of the golden mean. Virtue lies between two vices, one of excess, one of deficiency. Courage lies between recklessness and cowardice. Generosity lies between extravagance and stinginess. Even humor has its balance. Between the buffoon and the grouch lies the witty person. This pursuit of balance, of moderation, of practical reason, call it what you will, shaped the Western ideal of wisdom. It's not mysticism. It's not dogma. It's constant reflection, permanent adjustment, attention to context. And when you try to be reasonable in a discussion, when you seek the middle ground between extreme positions, when you distrust simple solutions to complex problems, you are, without knowing it, being Aristotelian. He doesn't govern you by imposition. He governs by infiltration. His ideas became so fundamental that they disappeared from view, like glasses you forgot you're wearing, like the grammar of your language. You apply it without thinking, without noticing, without questioning, and therein lies the paradox. The philosopher who taught the world to question everything became himself unquestioned. Not because he's perfect, not because he has all the answers, but because his questions are so good, so essential, so inescapable that we cannot think without them. Aristotle died over 2,300 years ago. But as long as you classify, reason, seek virtue, ask about the purpose of things, investigate nature, debate politics, analyze arguments, or simply try to live a good life, he will be alive. Inside you, silently governing the backstage of your mind. And now, knowing all of this, the question remains. If Aristotle shaped the way you think, without you ever having chosen it, could there be other ideas governing your mind that you've also never questioned?